You were never part of this family anyway, my son shouted across the Thanksgiving table while everyone else stared down at their plates in silence. The words hit me harder than the cold November wind outside. Not because they were loud, but because deep down I realized he had been feeling that way for a very long time. I stood there holding the pumpkin pie I had spent 4 hours baking that morning, the cinnamon still warm in the crust, the whipped cream slowly melting along the edges. Vanessa reached calmly for her wineglass beside him and took a small sip without saying a word. That silence hurt more than the shouting.
I'm Margaret Whitmore.
I'm 69 years old, a widow, and until that night I still believed Thanksgiving meant family. The dining room glowed with soft golden light from the chandelier David and I bought nearly 30 years ago during a clearance sale outside Columbus. I remember laughing because we barely had enough money for groceries back then, but my husband insisted that every family deserved at least one beautiful thing hanging over the dinner table. Now his son sat beneath that same chandelier looking at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. Mom, you always do this, Ethan muttered, rubbing his forehead with irritation. You make everything about yourself. I blinked at him, confused. All I had done was ask if we could say grace the way David used to. Just one small tradition. One small memory. Vanessa leaned back slowly in her chair, perfectly composed in her cream-colored sweater dress, her blonde hair smooth against her shoulders. Maybe tonight should be about moving forward, she said gently, but there was something cold hiding underneath her smile. Their 2 children kept staring at their mashed potatoes while football commentators echoed softly from the living room television. No one looked at me. No one defended me. I suddenly understood that I had already become a guest in my own family long before that dinner started. Outside, snow had begun falling across the neighborhood, covering the sidewalks and rooftops in quiet white layers. I carefully set the pie down on the counter beside the untouched dinner rolls. My hands were trembling, though I tried not to let anyone notice. I didn't mean to upset anyone, I said softly. Ethan let out a dry laugh that sounded nothing like the little boy who once begged me to stay beside his bed during thunderstorms. That's the problem, he snapped. You still think this is your family. The room went silent again. Somewhere upstairs, a door creaked softly in the house. Vanessa lowered her eyes like she was embarrassed for me instead of embarrassed by him. That was when I realized something even worse than rejection. This wasn't sudden. It wasn't anger spoken by accident. They had already decided where I belonged long before Thanksgiving dinner was served. I picked up my coat from the hallway bench and slipped my arms into the sleeves slowly. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. Vanessa simply said, "Drive safe, Margaret," in the same polite voice a hotel receptionist might use for a departing customer. I stepped outside into the freezing air carrying the untouched pie against my chest, while snowflakes melted quietly against my scarf. My old Buick took 3 tries to start. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced once at the glowing dining room window. Through the glass, I could see Ethan already sitting back down beside his wife, reaching for the turkey as if nothing had happened. Then my phone rang through the car speakers. The caller ID showed the name of my late husband's attorney, Daniel Mercer. I almost ignored it. But the moment I answered, his first sentence made my hands tighten around the steering wheel. "Margaret," he said carefully, "there's something David instructed me to give you if your family ever tried to push you out." I sat in my driveway for nearly 10 minutes after the call ended, watching snow collect along the edges of my windshield, while the engine rattled softly beneath me. Daniel Mercer had always spoken carefully, but tonight there was something heavier in his voice, something almost reluctant. "Your husband was very specific," he had told me before giving me an address downtown. "He said if the day ever came when you felt unwanted by your own family, I was to hand you everything personally. Everything personally." Those words stayed with me the entire drive home. The streets were nearly empty because of the holiday, just rows of glowing houses filled with warm dinners and laughter behind curtains. Every porch looked alive except mine. When I finally pulled into my garage, the motion light flickered on above the workbench David used for years. His old fishing poles still leaned in the corner beside a dusty red toolbox with a broken handle he always promised to fix. The sight of it made my chest ache in that quiet, familiar way grief settles into a person after enough time passes. Not sharp anymore. Just constant. I carried the untouched pumpkin pie inside and set it on the kitchen counter without turning on the lights. The refrigerator hummed softly in the silence. I could still smell cinnamon and turkey on my coat. For a long moment, I simply stood there staring at the empty chair beside the dining room window where David used to drink coffee every morning before sunrise. Sometimes I still caught myself listening for the sound of his slippers against the hardwood floor. It had been almost 14 months since the heart attack took him, but certain parts of the house still behaved as though he might walk back in at any moment. I slowly removed my gloves and noticed my hands were still trembling from the dinner. Not from anger, from realization. There is a difference. Anger fades. Realization changes you permanently. I opened the refrigerator and slid the untouched pie onto the shelf beside a carton of milk and leftover cranberry sauce. Then my eyes landed on the Thanksgiving centerpiece I had arranged the night before. Small white pumpkins, candles, autumn leaves from the tree in my backyard. I had spent nearly $50 on that centerpiece because Ethan used to love Thanksgiving at our house when he was little. He would run downstairs wearing flannel pajamas while David carved the turkey, and football played too loudly in the background. One year when Ethan was maybe 8 or 9, he made me a handwritten card that said, "Mom makes Thanksgiving feel like home." I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. Somewhere along the years between that little boy and the man sitting across from me tonight, something had quietly disappeared. Or maybe someone slowly removed me piece by piece until there was nothing left to defend. My phone buzzed again against the countertop. Another text from Ethan. For one foolish second I thought it might be an apology. Instead the message read, "You embarrassed Vanessa tonight. We need some space for a while." I stared at the screen until it dimmed in my hand. No apology. No concern about whether I made it home safely in the snow. Just blame wrapped in polite language. I set the phone face down and walked upstairs to my bedroom. David's navy bathrobe still hung behind the bathroom door exactly where he left it the week he died. I sat slowly on the edge of the bed and looked toward his side of the nightstand where his reading glasses still rested beside an unfinished mystery novel. Then I remembered something Daniel had said right before hanging up. "Margaret," he told me quietly, "your husband knew more than you think he did." I barely slept that night. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up pretending and walked downstairs wrapped in my old wool cardigan, while snow continued falling outside the kitchen windows. The house creaked softly the way old homes do during winter, settling into the cold darkness one sound at a time. I filled the kettle with water and stood quietly at the counter waiting for it to boil, staring at the framed family photos lining the wall beside the refrigerator. Ethan's high school graduation. Disney World in 1998. Christmas mornings with matching pajamas. There were dozens of photographs proving I had once belonged somewhere. Yet somehow, by Thanksgiving dinner, I had become a burden people tolerated out of obligation. I carried my tea into the living room and sat beneath the lamp beside David's recliner. My eyes drifted toward the hallway closet where I kept old photo albums and holiday decorations. For reasons I still cannot explain, I suddenly remembered something Vanessa said almost 6 months earlier during Ethan's birthday barbecue. We had all been standing on the back patio while the grandchildren chased fireflies through the yard. Vanessa smiled sweetly while handing me a paper plate and casually said, "Honestly, Margaret, this house is probably too much work for someone your age now." At the time I laughed it off. But later that same evening, I noticed Ethan walking through the property with a man I did not recognize. They spent nearly 20 minutes measuring parts of the backyard fence and discussing renovation costs, while pretending they were talking about football. Another memory surfaced immediately after that one. In September, I arrived at Ethan's house with homemade chicken soup because Vanessa had the flu. When I let myself in through the garage like I had done for years, the keypad code no longer worked. Ethan opened the door looking startled to see me standing there in the rain holding soup containers against my chest. "Oh," he said awkwardly. "We changed the code last week. I forgot to mention it." Forgot to mention it. That sentence suddenly sounded very different now. Back then I told myself families change. People get busy. Young couples need privacy. But sitting alone in my dark living room at 3 in the morning, I finally allowed myself to see the pattern clearly. It was never one big cruel moment. It was hundreds of tiny exclusions spread quietly over time. Vanessa operated that way. Never openly hostile. Never dramatic. Just careful. Calculated. She removed me slowly enough that Ethan never noticed he was helping her do it. Last Easter, she moved dinner reservations without telling me. At Olivia's piano recital, she accidentally forgot to save me a seat beside the family. 2 months ago, Ethan stopped sharing details about his work promotion until after the celebration already happened. Every small moment carried the same message underneath it. You are no longer central here. I wrapped both hands around my tea mug and stared at the snowfall outside while another memory returned, this one sharper than the rest. About a year before David died, I walked into the kitchen late one evening and found him sitting alone at the table reading paperwork with a troubled expression on his face. The moment he saw me, he closed the folder immediately. Everything all right? I asked him. He smiled, but it looked forced. Just making sure you are protected, he said quietly. At the time, I thought he meant retirement accounts or insurance forms. Now, sitting in the silence of our house with Daniel Mercer's words echoing in my mind, I realized my husband may have spent his final years preparing for something I was only beginning to understand. The next morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the neighborhood covered in a quiet white stillness that made everything look softer than it really was. I arrived at Daniel Mercer's office just before 9 carrying the same leather handbag I had owned for nearly 15 years. Downtown Columbus looked almost deserted after the holiday. Most storefronts were still dark, and the sidewalks glittered with frozen slush beneath the pale morning sun. Daniel's office sat on the 4th floor of an old brick building overlooking the river. David used to joke that lawyers intentionally chose uncomfortable furniture to keep people nervous. But when I stepped inside, everything felt strangely familiar. The receptionist recognized me immediately and offered a sad smile before leading me into Daniel's private office. He stood as soon as I entered. His gray suit looked perfectly pressed as always, but there was a heaviness in his expression I had never noticed before. Margaret, he said gently, motioning toward the chair across from his desk. I wish this meeting were happening under different circumstances. I sat down slowly and removed my gloves while he poured coffee into 2 small ceramic cups. For a moment neither of us spoke. Snow drifted softly outside the tall windows behind him. Finally, Daniel opened a thick folder resting on his desk and slid it carefully toward me. My husband's handwriting stared back at me from the front of a sealed envelope. Margaret. Only if necessary. My chest tightened instantly. David always wrote my name with a small curve beneath the final letter, as though he enjoyed taking an extra second just to finish it properly. I traced my fingers lightly across the ink before looking up at Daniel. How long have you had this? I asked, quietly. Almost 2 years, he admitted. David updated several legal documents shortly after his diagnosis. He gave very specific instructions about when I was allowed to show them to you. My stomach turned cold. Diagnosis? Daniel nodded slowly. Your husband knew his heart condition was worse than he admitted. I looked down at the envelope again, suddenly remembering all the nights David stayed awake long after I fell asleep. The extra paperwork. The quiet phone calls on the back porch. The way he watched Ethan and Vanessa sometimes with an expression I never fully understood. Daniel adjusted his glasses carefully before continuing. Margaret, your husband loved his family deeply. But toward the end, he became concerned about certain conversations regarding your home and finances. I felt my fingers tighten around the coffee cup. Conversations with Ethan? Daniel hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. My throat went dry. Daniel opened the folder and removed several property documents along with trust paperwork bearing David's signature. About 18 months before he passed away, your husband transferred the house and a significant portion of his assets into an irrevocable trust solely under your control. I stared at him in silence. What does that mean? Daniel folded his hands together. It means no one can pressure you into selling your home. It means no one can remove you from the property. And it means your son does not automatically inherit anything unless certain conditions are honored. The room suddenly felt very still. Conditions? I whispered. Daniel slid another document toward me. I read slowly, my vision blurring halfway through the paragraph. Any beneficiary found attempting coercion, manipulation, or intimidation against Margaret Whitmore regarding residency or financial control would immediately forfeit all inheritance rights. I read the sentence 3 times before looking up again. David wrote this himself? Daniel nodded. Your husband believed there might come a day when you would need protection from your own family. My chest ached so sharply I had to look away toward the snowy river outside the window. For nearly 43 years, David had loved me quietly, carefully, without grand speeches or dramatic gestures. And somehow, even near the end of his life, he had still been trying to stand between me and pain. Daniel let me sit in silence for a long time after I finished reading the documents. The only sound in the office was the faint ticking of the wall clock and the muffled hum of traffic below the building. I kept staring at David's signature at the bottom of the trust paperwork, remembering how steady his hands always looked even near the end of his life. He had known. Somehow, long before Thanksgiving dinner, long before Ethan shouted across that table, my husband had already seen the direction things were moving. There is something else, Daniel said carefully after a while. He opened another folder and removed several printed emails clipped neatly together. I debated whether or not to show you these, but I think David would have wanted complete honesty now. My stomach tightened again as he handed me the pages. The first email was from Ethan, dated almost 11 months before David passed away. Subject line: Future planning for the property. I felt heat rise behind my eyes as I read the words underneath. Ethan discussed renovation possibilities, resale value, and converting the upstairs office into a nursery expansion. Not once in the entire message did he mention me actually living there. It was as though I had already disappeared from the house completely. The second email hurt even more because it came from Vanessa. Her tone was polished and cheerful, the same way she always spoke at family dinners. She suggested that after David's condition worsens, it might be healthier for everyone if I considered a smaller environment with less responsibility. Smaller environment. I stared at the sentence for several seconds. She had already been planning my removal while my husband was still alive. Daniel watched me quietly from across the desk. David received copies of these during a financial consultation, he explained. He never confronted Ethan directly. I believe he hoped things would change on their own. I lowered the papers slowly into my lap. Suddenly I remembered one particular afternoon last spring. Vanessa had insisted on helping me clean the kitchen after Sunday lunch while Ethan and David watched baseball in the living room. At the time I thought she was finally warming up to me. But now I remembered the way her eyes lingered around the room. The cabinets. The windows. The hardwood floors. She even asked casually whether I had considered updating the property before eventually downsizing. I had laughed and told her David loved the house exactly the way it was. That conversation felt different now. Everything did. Margaret, Daniel said gently, pulling me back into the room, your husband added another instruction to the trust 6 months before he died. He slid a final paper toward me. If Ethan or anyone acting on his behalf attempts to pressure you emotionally or financially into leaving the property, they lose all remaining beneficiary status immediately. I looked up at him slowly. Even Ethan? Daniel nodded once. Especially Ethan. The words settled heavily inside my chest. Mothers spend most of their lives believing love alone can protect a family from becoming strangers. But sitting there in Daniel Mercer's office, I finally understood something painful. Love does not stop people from choosing convenience over loyalty. Outside the office window, snow continued drifting across the river in slow white waves. I folded the documents carefully back into the envelope bearing David's handwriting and held it against my chest for a moment. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I no longer felt helpless. Hurt, yes. Heartbroken, absolutely. But helpless? No. Because while Ethan and Vanessa believed they were slowly cornering an old widow with nowhere else to go, my husband had quietly built walls around me long before they ever made their first move. The days after my meeting with Daniel passed quietly on the surface, but underneath everything had changed. I moved through the house differently now, noticing details I used to ignore. The way sunlight stretched across David's favorite chair every morning. The tiny scratch marks on the kitchen floor from Ethan's toy trucks when he was little. The faint smell of cedar inside the hallway closet where we stored winter blankets. For years I thought this house held memories. Now I understood it also held evidence. Every room reminded me that David and I built this life together long before anyone else decided they were entitled to it. 3 days after Thanksgiving, Ethan finally called. I stood at the sink washing coffee cups when his name appeared across my phone screen. For a second, my heart reacted before my mind did. Mothers never completely lose hope, no matter how old their children become. I dried my hands slowly and answered. "Hi, Mom," he said, sounding unusually calm. Not apologetic. Controlled. I could hear Vanessa speaking faintly somewhere in the background. "Hello, Ethan." There was a brief silence before he cleared his throat. "I think things got a little emotional on Thanksgiving." Emotional. Such a clean word for cruelty. I stared out the kitchen window at the frozen backyard, while snow dripped slowly from the tree branches. "I see," I replied quietly. Ethan exhaled impatiently. "Look, Vanessa and I have been worried about you for a while now." There it was. Not guilt. Not regret. Concern. The same polished language from Vanessa's email. "You are alone in that big house," he continued. "And winter is not exactly easy at your age." At your age. I wrapped my fingers tighter around the edge of the counter. "I managed just fine." "That is not really the point," he said quickly. "We just think maybe it is time to start considering better long-term options." Better long-term options. I almost admired how carefully they rehearsed these conversations. "What kind of options?" I asked. Ethan sounded relieved that I had not argued. "There is a really nice senior community outside Dublin. Vanessa's aunt toured it last year. They have nurses, transportation, social activities. Honestly, Mom, it would probably be safer." Safer. Smaller environment. Less responsibility. The exact same phrases from the emails Daniel showed me. I closed my eyes briefly and pictured David sitting at this same kitchen table late at night, quietly preparing legal protections while pretending everything was normal. My husband had seen this coming long before I did. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully. "I will think about it." Ethan sounded surprised by how easily I agreed. "Really?" "Of course," I replied softly. "You only want what is best for me." Another silence followed. I could practically hear Vanessa listening nearby. Then Ethan's voice relaxed for the first time during the conversation. "Good. That is good, Mom. We can all sit down after Christmas and figure things out together." Figure things out together. I almost smiled at the irony. After we hung up, I carried my coffee into the living room and sat beside the Christmas tree I had decorated alone the night before. White lights glowed softly against the ornaments David and I collected over 4 decades. Handmade snowflakes from Ethan's elementary school years still hung beside crystal angels and faded red ribbons. I reached toward one old ornament shaped like a tiny wooden house, and remembered Ethan giving it to me when he was 10 years old. "So you never forget where home is," he had said proudly. I held the ornament gently in my palm while snow continued falling outside the windows. Then for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a small quiet smile. Because Ethan and Vanessa believed I was beginning to surrender. They thought loneliness had weakened me. What they did not understand was that I had finally stopped confusing silence with helplessness. December arrived quietly after that. The neighborhood filled with glowing wreaths, inflatable snowmen, and strings of colored lights hanging from rooftops while Christmas music drifted softly through grocery stores and coffee shops. Everywhere I went, people smiled at strangers and wished each other happy holidays, but beneath all that warmth, I carried a strange calmness I had not felt in months. It was the calm that comes when confusion finally disappears. Once you understand who people truly are, you stop exhausting yourself searching for kinder explanations. A week before Christmas, Ethan invited me to dinner again. This time his voice sounded almost cheerful when he called. "The kids really want you there," he said warmly. "Vanessa is making prime rib, and Olivia keeps asking if Grandma is coming." I stood beside my dining room window while he spoke, watching snow gather along the porch railing outside. "That sounds lovely," I answered. "I would not miss Christmas dinner." Ethan sounded relieved again, the same way he did after I agreed to think about the retirement community. "Good," he said quickly. "And maybe after dinner we can talk a little more about future plans." No pressure or anything. Future plans. Such harmless words for something so carefully calculated. "Of course," I replied softly. "Whatever is best for the family." After we hung up, I walked slowly into David's old study carrying the folder Daniel Mercer had given me. The room still smelled faintly like cedarwood and aftershave. I sat at the desk where my husband used to balance checkbooks and organize fishing licenses every spring. For nearly an hour I reread every page inside the trust documents. Each sentence felt less painful now and more deliberate. David had not acted out of anger. He acted out of certainty. That realization changed everything for me. The following afternoon, Vanessa stopped by unexpectedly carrying a tin of peppermint cookies wrapped in silver ribbon. She smiled brightly the moment I opened the door. "I was in the neighborhood and thought you might like these," she said sweetly. Her perfume filled the hallway as she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. I thanked her politely and led her into the kitchen while she admired the Christmas decorations with careful eyes. "The house still looks beautiful," she said casually. "Although honestly, keeping up with a property this size must be exhausting now." I poured coffee into 2 mugs and handed one to her without reacting. Vanessa sat gracefully at the table, crossing her legs neatly beneath her cream-colored coat. "Ethan worries about you," she continued gently. "We both do." There was that polished concern again. Always wrapped in kindness. Never direct enough to sound cruel. "That is thoughtful of you," I replied quietly. Vanessa smiled, clearly encouraged by my calmness. "You deserve peace, Margaret. Somewhere easier. Somewhere people can help take care of you." I stirred cream slowly into my coffee while studying her face. Younger than mine by nearly 30 years. Smooth skin. Perfect posture. Confident in ways people become when life has rarely told them no. "You know," she added carefully, "the market is incredible right now. This house could easily sell for over $800,000. There it was at last. Not hidden beneath concern anymore. The real conversation. I lowered my spoon gently onto the saucer. "David loved this house," I said softly. Vanessa gave a sympathetic smile that never reached her eyes. "Of course. But sometimes holding on to the past keeps people from moving forward." I looked at the Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner of the living room while snow drifted outside the windows. Then I turned back toward my daughter-in-law and smiled for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner. "You may be right," I told her calmly. And in that moment, Vanessa truly believed she was winning. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in fresh snow and freezing wind that rattled softly against my car windows as I drove toward Ethan's neighborhood. The streets glowed with colored lights and oversized wreaths hanging from nearly every porch. Families hurried through the cold carrying wrapped presents and trays of desserts while church bells echoed faintly somewhere downtown. Everything looked exactly the way Christmas should look. Warm. Safe. Whole. I parked carefully along the curb outside Ethan's house and sat there for a moment with my hands resting quietly on the steering wheel. Through the front windows I could already see the tree glowing beside the fireplace. Olivia and Mason raced through the living room wearing matching red pajamas while Vanessa moved gracefully between the dining room and kitchen carrying wine glasses. For one brief second I allowed myself to remember older Christmases. Ethan falling asleep beside piles of wrapping paper. David sneaking extra whipped cream onto my pumpkin pie when he thought I was not looking. The sound of Bing Crosby records playing while snow covered the backyard fence. Then I reached into my purse and lightly touched the folder Daniel Mercer had prepared for me earlier that week. The papers inside felt heavier than they should have. By the time I stepped onto the porch, my expression had already settled back into calmness. Vanessa opened the door before I could knock. "Margaret," she said brightly, leaning forward to kiss my cheek. "You look wonderful." She wore an elegant dark green dress with gold earrings that caught the Christmas lights every time she moved. Ethan appeared behind her carrying a glass of bourbon. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said warmly, as though Thanksgiving had never happened at all. I smiled gently and handed Olivia the tin of homemade fudge I brought for the children. Dinner looked perfect. Prime rib rested at the center of the table surrounded by candles, rosemary potatoes, and crystal serving bowls Vanessa probably spent hours arranging. Christmas music drifted softly through hidden speakers while everyone complimented the food and discussed school schedules, weather forecasts, and holiday travel plans. On the surface, we looked like a family again. But once you see manipulation clearly, you start noticing every carefully timed glance beneath the performance. Vanessa poured me extra wine twice. Ethan kept asking whether I felt lonely in such a large house. Even Olivia innocently mentioned that Mommy found a really pretty retirement place with a movie theater. The entire evening moved carefully toward one destination. After dessert, Ethan finally cleared his throat and exchanged a quick look with Vanessa. "Mom," he began gently, "there is something we wanted to talk about while everyone is together." I folded my napkin calmly beside my plate. "Of course." Vanessa reached into a leather folder resting near her chair and removed several documents clipped neatly together. "We actually met with a real estate advisor last week," she explained sweetly, "just to explore possibilities." Ethan slid the papers slowly across the table toward me. "Nobody is forcing you into anything," he added quickly. "We just think this is the smartest long-term decision." I glanced down at the paperwork. Preliminary home sale agreements, senior living brochures, financial projections, estimating property profit after renovations. Everything already prepared before they ever asked my opinion. My chest tightened for only a second before the feeling disappeared completely. Because at that exact moment the front doorbell rang through the house. Vanessa looked startled. Ethan frowned in confusion. "Were you expecting someone?" he asked. I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip before answering. "Actually," I said softly, "I believe that is my attorney." The entire dining room froze the moment Daniel Mercer stepped through the front doorway carrying his black leather briefcase dusted lightly with snow. Christmas music still played softly in the background while nobody at the table seemed to remember how to breathe normally. Ethan stared at me in disbelief. Vanessa's hand remained frozen around her wineglass, though I noticed her smile disappear almost instantly. Daniel removed his coat calmly and nodded politely toward everyone in the room before looking directly at me. "Good evening, Margaret," he said in the same steady voice he used in his office. "I apologize for interrupting Christmas dinner." "Not at all," I replied quietly. "Please join us." Ethan stood abruptly from his chair. "Mom, what is going on?" His face had already begun losing color. I folded my napkin neatly onto the table and reached for the leather folder beside my plate. "I believe all of us are finally ready to discuss future plans," I answered softly. Daniel opened his briefcase and removed several documents while the grandchildren sat silently near the fireplace sensing tension they did not fully understand. Vanessa recovered first, forcing a small nervous laugh. "I think there has been some misunderstanding," she said carefully. "Ethan and I were only trying to help Margaret consider safer options." Daniel adjusted his glasses and calmly placed the trust documents at the center of the dining table. "Actually," he said, "these documents exist specifically because Mr. David Whitmore anticipated conversations like this might occur." Ethan frowned. "What conversations?" Daniel looked directly at him. "Attempts to pressure your mother into surrendering control of her residence or financial assets." Silence spread across the room so completely that I could hear the fireplace crackling beside the tree. Vanessa slowly lowered her wineglass onto the tablecloth. "Pressure," she repeated carefully. "That is ridiculous." Daniel slid another document toward Ethan. "Your father established an irrevocable trust approximately 18 months before his death. Under its terms, Margaret Whitmore maintained sole control over the property and associated assets during her lifetime." Ethan stared down at the papers in confusion. "Wait, the house is in a trust." "Correct," Daniel replied calmly. "Furthermore, any beneficiary found attempting emotional coercion, manipulation, or intimidation regarding Mrs. Whitmore's living situation immediately forfeits inheritance rights." I watched Ethan's face carefully as the meaning finally reached him. "What?" he whispered. Vanessa leaned forward quickly. "That cannot possibly apply to us." Daniel opened another file. "I am afraid it already does." The room went completely still again. Ethan looked from Daniel to me like a man suddenly realizing the floor beneath him was not solid after all. "Mom," he said slowly, "you seriously brought a lawyer here on Christmas?" I held his gaze quietly across the table. "No, Ethan. Your father brought him here long before either of us knew we would need him." Vanessa's expression tightened for the first time since I met her nearly 13 years ago. "This is unbelievable," she muttered. "After everything we have done for you." I almost smiled at that sentence. People reveal themselves most clearly when disappointment replaces politeness. Daniel calmly gathered the remaining papers into neat stacks. "Mr. Whitmore's instructions were extremely specific," he continued. The property remains solely under Mrs. Whitmore's authority. In addition, due to recent documented conversations regarding forced relocation and financial pressure, both Ethan and Vanessa Whitmore have officially triggered removal clauses within the trust. Ethan stared at him in shock. "You are saying we get nothing?" Daniel answered gently. "I am saying your father loved your mother enough to protect her even after he was gone." Nobody spoke after that. The Christmas lights reflected softly against the dining room windows while snow continued falling outside. Finally, I stood slowly from the table and reached for my coat near the hallway chair. Ethan looked up at me with an expression I had not seen since childhood. Not anger. Fear. "Mom," he said quietly, "please do not leave like this." I slipped my gloves on carefully before answering. "I already left weeks ago, Ethan. Tonight was simply the first time you noticed." Then I stepped outside into the cold December air, while snowflakes drifted softly beneath the streetlights. For the first time since David died, I no longer felt abandoned. Because family is not the people who wait for your weakness. Family is the person who protects your dignity long after they are gone.